stragglers to arrive, and if they do come, everyone will look at the same time when they come in late, but we're going to start now anyway, okay? Thanks, first of all, for coming to our latest Pacific Region Forum on Business and Management Communication. We're really lucky today, and I know I say this every time, but just had lunch.
I didn't know that.
He's a real interesting talker. Steve Weiss has been doing international business at various universities in the U.S. and in Canada. He's been at York since how long?
91.
Pardon?
91. Almost
okay.
15 years.
91. Wow. And a lot of other interesting things that you can read on what you've undoubtedly already seen here. But there's one other thing that you must know about him, and that is he's on the editorial review board of JIBS. That's the Journal of International Business. Are you still on it? He's on the Journal of International Business Studies, which is sort of, if you want to get tenure and promoted and that sort of thing in Faculty of Business Administration anywhere, that's a very, very good journal to be able to brag that you've been published in. Today he's he knows, I think he's been briefed on how we usually handle these things. We have the presentation is usually done within an hour, and then we leave a half an hour for discussion of his presentation, which is why we call it a forum rather than a lecture, not just a lecture, but on planning for international negotiations, a systematic approach with Asia, North America illustrations. And so that's my speeches. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, John. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'd forgotten how beautiful this city is until lunchtime today. I went out for a quick run when it was still fairly dark, and then Jan took me to lunch, and on the way to lunch, I saw peeking between two buildings the mountains in the distance, and they looked awfully spectacular. In Ontario, we have hills. Nothing like that. So I hope you know how special a setting you're in here. As John mentioned, I would like to talk today about planning for international business negotiation. And what I'd like to present is a fairly general framework, one that I think can be used in any or for any negotiation. But our interest today is going to be why it should work for international business as well, and how international business affects certain parts of the framework. I'm going to certainly try to keep it within an hour. If not, sort of let me know. But I'd encourage you to raise questions as I go. I'd really like to make this as interactive as possible. There's no need for me to talk straight for an hour. And I'm actually quite interested in your reactions to some of the ideas that I'm going to present. So the more you raise them as we go along, I think the more useful it will be. Okay? Negotiation, or preparing for negotiation. This is, you see on the screen behind me a couple of quotes, and the first one could be taken from just about anyone. All right, this is Lee Thompson, who's at the Kellogg School at Northwestern University. He's written a lot about negotiation. She says the most important aspect of negotiation happens before you even sit down at the table. And there are a lot of other expressions that you can read like that in the literature or from practitioners. Success in negotiation is 95% preparation, things like that. And then from Charlene Barshevsky, who was a U.S. trade representative under Bill Clinton for, I think, both terms, she said, you'd be surprised how many people don't actually know what they want to the degree of precision that's required for a negotiation. So there's this certainly strong belief that preparation matters, and yet, curiously, practitioners generally talk about not having enough time to prepare or not having prepared enough. And academics haven't spent a lot of time studying it. Researchers haven't spent a lot of time studying it. So there seems to be a gap there, and certainly a need on the part of practitioners. Let's talk a bit about what's the kinds of frameworks that are out there right now, a limited number, and then go on from there. They're based primarily on concepts that Harvard introduced, and especially Roger Fisher and Bill Urey back in '81 when they wrote the what has been since referred to as the Big Bang book in the field of negotiation, called Getting to Yes. One of their concepts was the idea of an interest. Okay? What negotiators are really trying to satisfy or accomplish when they negotiate. Not necessarily what they say they want, but what lies behind what they say they want. Okay? So in a sales negotiation, when a seller has offered set a certain price on what they're trying to sell, why is it that they've set that price, and what are they really after? All right? Are they after, is it just a matter of revenue? Are they concerned about profit margins? Maybe they're not concerned about either of those things. Maybe they set a low price, actually, because they're trying to build market share. Okay? So it has to do with getting behind the positions that negotiators take to understand what they're really after. And just as a footnote, the value of an interest to a negotiator is that it generally allows the negotiator to pursue different paths to satisfaction, right? As opposed to a bargaining position which is fixed and pinpointed. An interest is generally more vague, broader, and there are many ways to satisfy it. One of those might be acceptable to the other side. Okay? So we have this notion of an interest as a key idea when it comes to thinking about negotiation. And the other idea made popular by Getting to Yes is a BATNA. Leave it to an academic to come up with an acronym as opposed to an easy-to-say word, right? But best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And here, as you see on the screen, there are a number of features that are important. First off, we're talking about how you can satisfy your interests, what it is you're trying to accomplish in a negotiation, outside of the current negotiation. What other alternatives do you have? When we're shopping for a fairly expensive item, maybe a laptop computer, we'll generally go to multiple vendors, right? We won't go to a single one. We'll compare where else we can get a deal. And the idea of a BATNA is instead of keeping 3 or 4 other alternatives in mind, pick out the best one, right? Because really that's the only one that you have to beat when you're negotiating with this vendor right here, right? So it's a single point. It's not a different package that you can arrange with the current vendor that you're working with. It's outside of the negotiation. It may not necessarily be a good alternative, but it's the best of what you got. Okay, everywhere else may be more expensive, but you're looking at which one is best out of the alternatives that you've got, and you can see concrete, probable, and reliable. So it's not simply an alternative that you might pursue, but you've actually checked it out to see whether it's there. All right? Now, with these two concepts, all right, interests and a BATNA, the few planning systems that are out there have sort of been based on them. And I think it's really evident in this one right here. Thompson herself, all right, when she came up with 6 steps for good negotiation planning, spends the first 3 talking about a BATNA, right? Determine your own, improve it, get as good a BATNA as you can because it gives you leverage, right, in the current negotiations, and find out what the others is. All right? In the other 2, Fisher, that's Roger Fisher again, who wrote, I think he called it Preparing for Negotiation. So he has this thing about gerunds, you know, getting together, getting to yes, getting past no was another one. Preparing. But here you see in his first 2 steps, if he's talking about how should you prepare well for negotiation, he says interests, options, BATNA. Again, you see those concepts showing up again. And then Richard Shell, who's at the Wharton School, he's got a more elaborate one with 9 steps, but nonetheless, he too talks about interests and leverage coming from BATNA or alternatives. Right? That's what's out there right now. in terms of existing planning systems. And there are others, but they're fairly similar to what we've got there. Yeah?
Since you invited questions,
Go right ahead.
am I to understand that, so in Thompson's scenario here, that you go directly to a BATNA, and is that a way of framing the actual agreement that you're seeking?
This is not how to negotiate, it's how to plan for negotiation.
But
right?
First you determine your alternative, and that frames how you're
Yes.
going to
Yeah. No, and let's see if we can come back to that, because certainly one of the questions you could ask is how does that frame your approach? How does it affect your interaction with your counterpart when a lot of your focus or where your orientation has to do with where else you could go? No, I think that's a good question. Let's pull back just a second, though. Preparing and planning tend to be used as if they're equivalent terms, and I think this quote that you see from Richard Holbrooke, U.S. ambassador in the Dayton talks when Yugoslavia was being, when they were trying to resolve it. I think his quote there really makes you think whether preparing and planning are the same thing, right? Negotiations were simultaneously cerebral and physical, abstract and personal, something like a combination of chess and mountain climbing. It's a really rich description, which made me think, well, wait a minute, preparing and planning, maybe they're not the same thing. I mean, think about an athlete, tennis player preparing for Wimbledon. What are all the, or even, we just had the Olympics. What are all the things that Olympic athletes do in order to prepare, to perform well during the Olympics? There's a whole range of things. So if we're talking about preparation, maybe we could be talking about practicing certain types of behavior, like negotiation training. We could be talking about analytical preparation, or intellectual things, psychological, physiological, like getting a good night's sleep, among other things. I'd like to draw a distinction between preparing, which is basically everything that you do in order to perform effectively during the negotiation, and a segment called planning, right? Or a piece of it, which is called planning. And there we're talking about really setting up action sequences, right? A set of actions that will get us to a particular goal. So I want to be clear about what we're working on this afternoon. I want to focus just on that planning segment, but give recognition to other things that you all could be doing in order to prepare or be ready for negotiation. Okay? Now, if we're talking about planning, there are, essentially three concerns, I think, that we should deal with. One is, what are we trying to accomplish? What are our goals? Who are we negotiating with? And how are we going to get there? And if we're talking about planning for an international negotiation, I think a lot of the focus in current literature is on cultural factors, right? International negotiation, that must mean culture, right? Let's focus on how the Japanese negotiate or how the Chinese negotiate. Well, I think we've both overestimated the role of culture and underestimated it. We've underestimated it to the extent that we've focused on how people behave and set aside how they think and the values that drive that behavior. And we've overestimated it because we've left other factors out of the picture. Now, this quote from Glenn Fukushima, who was director of the Japan Bureau of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, I think actually under Barshevsky, speaks just to that point. And this was in reaction, he wrote a commentary on an article that I wrote several years ago called Negotiating with Romans. And it was about cultural aspects of negotiation. And I wasn't trying to say that culture is the most important thing. It was more, if you're thinking about cultural factors, what might you do about them? But he construed it to be sort of an overemphasis on culture, as you see there, right? Culture is only one variable that can shape the dynamics of negotiation. Other things could be much more important. What's the purpose and context of the negotiation? What's the position of the counterpart in his or her organization? How does that counterpart feel about negotiating with people, with Americans, and whoever else it might be? Right? So he gets us thinking about, well, what other factors might we consider to plan well for negotiation? Well, I think one broad perspective that's really effective for considering a range of factors is what I call this RBC perspective. Negotiation's been defined as the deliberate interaction of parties who are attempting to define or redefine the terms of their interdependence. In other words, they're trying to set up a relationship. Okay, you can think of negotiation as that. So if you think of relationships as the focal point in a negotiation, whatever level it might be, between individuals, between groups, and then try to back off of that to think about what factors drive certain types of relationships and the dynamics within those relationships, I think there are two sets of factors. One is behavior, what the negotiators themselves actually do in the process, and the other is conditions of many types, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. It could range from the circumstances, what's going on in the room where the negotiators are negotiating, to broader forces at play out in the marketplace, right? Competitive factors, government regulations, whatever you might have. And what I'd like to do is use this perspective, this RBC perspective, to set up a planning system, okay? Now, this is a stripped down and basic form. You could have what's happened in the relationship in the past affecting what's happening in the relationship now, all right? There could be all sorts of arrows in there. But just keep the simple format in mind for now, right? Focal point is relationships, and we're trying to understand how to develop certain types of relationships. What can be done to develop certain types during a negotiation, right? And that draws us to behaviors and influencing conditions. Here are the 6 steps I'd like to focus on. Okay? And I'll go through them just really quickly now, and then we'll go through each in turn. First off, instead of diving right into the planning process we're talking about, just sort of slowly getting started, getting a feel for what the situation is, which I call sketch the situation. Then focusing in on the substance of the negotiations. All right? What are the parties going to be talking about? What topics or issues, as I mentioned there? All right? What are the parties after? What are their interests? Yes, I'm using that term too. All right? We'll talk a bit about that later. Then a third step is researching the details. All right? Really doing your homework on all sorts of items. And again, we'll dig into that in just a bit. Fourth, formulating your representation. Now, for some people, formulate seems like a pretty esoteric or unusual term to use, or maybe a typically academic one, but I chose it very deliberately. Okay? We're talking about setting up your goals in a very particular way. Right, and figuring out how you're going to represent what it is you're after as you talk or interact to the other side. That's why I've chosen the word formulate. Envision the interaction. All right, what happens when you get into the negotiation room with the other side, and what's that dynamic going to look like? How can you plan for that? Why have I chosen the word envision? Because you can't plan it or really control it. The other side is going to affect how that interaction unfolds. All right, you're just one part of it. And then finally, arranging the site. Right? How can you set up the site, the physical and social circumstances in such a way that they enable you to excel in that setting? If you prefer diagrams, there you have it there. Notice that steps 2 through 5 are iterative. Right? It's not just a sequential process where you never look back to the step that you just passed, but there are connections between them. Okay? Especially between those 4. Now let's dig in and take a look at what this might look like. Sketch the situation. So there we're talking about, I'd say, writing something that might take a third or half a page, right? It's just a way of getting the wheel started. Instead of diving right into the planning process, first warming up, right, to identify some of the key or basic elements involved. Things like who's involved, what's the negotiation about, why do you expect to negotiate, all right, or intend to negotiate, and then a bit about context, and more specifically the relationship and then some of the conditions that might influence it. And you can use the good old RBC perspective to structure some of that. Okay? So that we might talk about a Canadian company in power generation looking for a source of steel, structural steel, in order to build a power plant in Taiwan. All right? That's identified sort of what the negotiation's about, who they're negotiating with, and then you could build around that. And one of the things that you might find helpful is just writing down sort of who's involved. Now here, this is pretty basic, where you've got, and these are sort of disguised names, but Elgin is the Canadian power generation company, and RMC is the Taiwanese steel maker. Right? But you've got the individuals there, the departments, and some of the organizational context. It's even more helpful to do something like this in a very complicated negotiation where you've got multiple parties, just trying to make sense of who's involved. And I'll show you a pretty complicated example of this in just a bit. So that's the first step, sketching the situation. All right? It's that foray into the planning process. Then identifying interests, what the parties are after, and what they're going to be talking about. And one of the easiest ways to do this, I think, is to start by listing the topics you expect to discuss as you see typical issues there in a sales or a procurement negotiation. Right? What's the product or service we're talking about? Price. Product specifications, maybe a number of units, delivery time, terms of payment. Those would all be typical issues. And then you can think about related interests on your side, all right, in here, issues or interests related to each of those issues. And on the other side, all right, when it comes to figuring out what in this case, the supplier is trying to get out of the negotiation, talking about putting yourself in their shoes. Right? And there might be a variety of ways that you can come up with what those interests might be, so that you end up with a chart that might look like that. Okay? Now notice for product specifications, right, up at the top. If we're the buyer, why do we care about product specifications? Or I might be concerned that the product can actually do what we're looking for it to do, all right, that it meets the purposes that we have for it. Might be concerned about reliability. Might be some other interests there as well. And if we're trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the supplier, what might be some of their concerns related to specifications? Well, limiting costs, among other things, right? The more features, the higher the cost, and the lower the profit margin. They might also be concerned about customer satisfaction, all right? Keeping us happy if they hope that there are going to be future purchases down the line. So you can see how that works as you go right down the chart. Okay? Issues are what we're talking about, or what's going to be negotiated. And then on either side, you've got what each side is trying to satisfy with respect to those issues. Notice one other point. On the left-hand side there, you'll notice that there are corporate or organizational interests, right? Especially when we've got a buyer that's representing an organization. But there might also be individual ones. Like closing a deal might be related to the individual getting a bonus, right? Because they've hit their quota for the month. that can be an interest that's going to affect the negotiations, or that a buyer planning for negotiation would want to have in mind, right? Getting the deal done because it's going to affect his bonus. Now, if you get into our third step, right, researching the details, well, everyone talks about doing your homework, but what in particular are we talking about there? What kinds of things matter? Well, if we're talking about a procurement negotiation, a particular product, one of the things that you might want to really look into is the product itself. All right? Not just the product produced by the supplier, but other ones available. What are the features of the product that the current supplier does have available? Can you find out about other customers' uses of it? So on. Basically, just becomes very well versed in what you're negotiating over. Study the counterpart you're going to be negotiating with. What's their approach to the negotiation process? I mean, how do they look at it? What capabilities or resources do they have available? All right? And how could this be influenced by certain types of conditions? Again, going back to the RBC thing. Is there a relationship between the counterparts? Right? Have you negotiated with this counterpart before, and what kind of tradition is there in the negotiations that you've had? Or if you're taking over for someone else who's negotiated with this individual in the past, what's the nature of the relationship that that individual had with your predecessor? All right? And when it comes to the kind of deal that you're looking for, what would constitute a good one? Now, if we take a few of these in turn, okay, there you can see, again, a variety of types of conditions. And you can see that even more clearly in this chart. Right? Cultures could be national or ethnic, but they could also be organizational or professional. Right? Environments, we're talking about the environment of the firm, what's going on in the marketplace, or what sorts of political factors are relevant, whether it's government regulations or other kinds of dynamics at that level, legal systems. Okay? All the factors that might influence how the counterpart behaves, and for that matter, how you might have to behave in the negotiations. All right? Being clear on that. When it comes to parties involved, here is the chart that I was talking about. Now take a look at that. This is a depiction of Nissan's negotiations with Renault in the late 90s. All right? Now focus first on the right-hand side. You can see Hanawa, the president of Nissan, led the negotiations, but he also had people on the negotiation team who helped, right, just under him. He had to report back to some executives, not to a great extent, but that connection was there. That was just Nissan Motor. But then Nissan Motor was within a larger group, as you see there, the Nissan Group. We've got Nissan Diesel, which was also up for the situation here, actually, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. Nissan was in deep, deep financial and competitive trouble in the late 90s. Okay? It needed $6 billion to pay off debt. It had been losing market share to Toyota. Its cars were perceived as dogs in the U.S. market. It was in deep trouble. And this was months after Daimler and Chrysler had just merged. All right? So not only were there GM, Toyota, and Ford out there, but now there was Daimler Chrysler. So the second tier of automakers, right, the Nissans, the Renaults, were very worried about their ultimate survival. Right? Not only was there this long-term issue, but in addition, Nissan had immediate financial trouble. Right? They had debt that they had to pay off within a few months, and they were looking for $6 billion worth of cash. So Renault actually approached Nissan. They got involved in those negotiations, and you can see on the Renault side who all was involved there within the Renault group. But at a certain point, Hanawa also started talking to Daimler Chrysler, who you see down in the bottom, and also approached Ford. Okay. You've also got, if you just go back to Nissan and Renault and try to figure out sort of what else was going on that could affect the Nissan-Renault negotiations, look at the connections with different government groups. Okay, the French Ministry of Economy, Ministry of Industry, Treasury Department, which was a factor because Renault was still about 44% government-owned, right? And it was the Treasury Department that managed that relationship. In short, if you had been Renault looking to negotiate with Nissan, these are some of the parties that you would want to know about and do some research on, because they had the potential to affect your negotiations with Nissan. Okay? And just mapping them out in what's called a party map like this, I think helps to see what's going on and where you may need to put some effort. Now, another part of researching the details is trying to get a sense of how your counterpart is going to approach the negotiations. Do they have the same sense of what negotiation is that you do? And what you see up here is a list of factors or aspects of the negotiation process that can vary from culture to culture. Okay? Starting with just what negotiation entails, the basic concept of the process. How do people negotiate? How should they negotiate? Trying to get a sense of how your counterpart looks at negotiation, right? All the way down to what would be a satisfactory agreement. Are we looking for a detailed contract that lays out every possible contingency and the response for that contingency, or something broader, maybe a 2 or 3 page statement of principles? Rather than go through each of these at this point, let me just lay this out, and if you want to, we can go back to it. But basically, this is a set of about 12 variables, a way of trying to get an understanding of how your counterpart is going to approach the negotiations, right? So that you can actually come up with a picture of who you face on the other side in the negotiations that you're planning for. Here you've got a profile for I'd say classic Japanese negotiator. Okay. Some stereotyping we could talk about, but notice how different a number of these dimensions might be to dimensions that you're accustomed to. Okay? But at least you've taken that first step to try to get a sense of how they're going to approach the negotiations with you. A couple more factors to consider with respect to researching the details. What kind of agreement are you trying to reach with the other side? Right? The sense of what would you be happy with? And trying to be clear about what those characteristics would be. And there are a whole range of possibilities, as you see there. And people differ in what they consider a good agreement. Right? So there's nothing cut and dried about what constitutes a good agreement. I think this is something that you have to decide for yourself. Right? Whether you're talking about meeting your aspirations, your sort of dream goals, or trying to get more than the other side gets out of the negotiation. Whichever it is, selecting the one and being clear about it. Yeah?
Yeah, in the previous example you said about the Ford and the Daimler and Chrysler and all. And you said that you should map all these things and you should try to know what the other parties are trying to do. But like the other two companies are American in nature and won't be getting information about what they are trying to negotiate with the Nissan. Won't it be that difficult? I mean, is it easy or difficult? Like getting the
to obtain information about what's going on in the other negotiations?
Yeah, the Nissan and Ford and Nissan and Daimler and Chrysler, and how does it affect the negotiation between Renault and Nissan?
Uncertainty. It raises your uncertainty level. In fact, Nissan and Renault had been negotiating started in July of 98, and in January, the president of Renault, became so worried about the negotiations between Daimler and Nissan that he thought he had less than a 50% chance of actually reaching an agreement with Nissan. But he didn't know, right? All he knew, because Hanoa actually told him, was that Nissan was negotiating with Daimler Chrysler. But in terms of how far along are those negotiations, how good a deal has Daimler proposed, and how does that compare with what I, Schweitzer, am offering, he didn't have access to that information.
But he's better prepared because he knows all this.
That the talks are actually going on?
Yeah. So he's better prepared for the negotiation.
I think he was better prepared for other reasons. I mean, he really did his homework and developed the relationship slowly over time. Not to mention the fact that they reached a few agreements where he insisted on exclusivity. Right. So towards the end, he actually tried to freeze Daimler out so he wouldn't have to worry so much about it. But the basic factor when your counterpart is negotiating with someone else is it raises your uncertainty level, right? I mean, there's even less control over what's going on in the negotiation process. One other factor to consider in terms of research. So much of the literature on negotiation in the bookstore today emphasizes what you can get out of negotiation, right? What you can extract. I don't know of any books that talk about what you can contribute, what you can put in. And yet, the other side's certainly not just going to give stuff over, right? It's important to think about what you have to offer of value to them, just as it is important to think about what they have of value to you, maybe beyond what's on the typical agenda. And some of the things that not only U.S. but Canadian cities, municipalities and provinces have offered foreign automakers, when automakers have announced that they're going to set up an assembly plant, are astounding. Right? And it's in part because the automakers really know sort of just how capable and how many resources the governments can put their fingers on. Okay? I mean, to pick an example sort of out of this context, when Mercedes went down to Alabama, they were not only able to get land very cheaply, I think it was $100 or something just nominal like that. All sorts of infrastructure improvements, tax holidays, and so on. But also things like a commitment from the government of Alabama to purchase vehicles from Mercedes. Imagine being a state official and driving around a Mercedes, but Daimler was actually able to swing that. Some of the German employees were concerned about their children falling behind in the U.S. school system because it was only Monday through Friday, so the Daimler officials pushed the state officials to offer Saturday classes through the school system and so on. Right? So sort of going beyond the page to think about what are the resources and capabilities of the other side. When you talk about value creation, this is where it comes from. It doesn't come from interest. That's what people want. But how are they going to get there? Through resources. Fourth step, formulating your representation. Now this is what people typically think of as planning, especially in a negotiation context, right? Setting your goals, coming up with a strategy for how to attain them, and so on. Let's take a look at this one. Prague. We're not in Asia, we're in Europe for a second. By objectives, right, negotiation objectives, I mean not what you see there in Dilbert. But an objective is something concrete and measurable. Okay? So, instead of, I want a good price, when we're talking about an objective, we're talking about price X. If we go back to the Nissan-Renault example, right, we need cash to pay down debt. The objective is $6 billion. It's concrete, it's measurable. What's the value of actually using objectives and interests, and usually you'll find one recommendation or the other, right? In a book like Getting to Yes, they'll say focus on interests, set aside objectives or positions, right? You don't want to get into a zero-sum or positional game. And if you go back 20 years before that and look at negotiation books based on the labor movement, they focus on how to get what you want. They focus on objectives, targets. What I'm suggesting here is that you actually use both of these because each has value, right? What's the value of interests? As you see there, all right? That's, in the end, what you're really trying to satisfy. Usually there's more than one way to satisfy an interest, so it gives you some flexibility. The way that you thought you would be able to satisfy the interest may not be the acceptable to the other side, but if you can think of some of those alternatives and focus on the interest, maybe one of those will hit, right? So it increases the probability of agreement. However, interests tend to be fuzzy. So if you go into a procurement negotiation and all you have in mind is, I want a good price, and the other side comes back with a specific price, can you answer that? Or do you have to sit there thinking, is that a good price? All right? You may need to be well enough prepared to be able to answer right then and there. That's the value of an objective, all right? An instant measure. You've thought in advance what price you're willing to pay. You get a particular offer from the vendor or the supplier, and you can respond right then and there. But the drawback is that when you're talking about not so much objectives, but the positions that represent those objectives, right, concrete and measurable, it's really easy to get into, thank you very much, positional bargaining. So you're going back and forth on price, when other concerns, other interests might be neglected. It may not be, all right, that a particular price is what matters, but for the vendor, it's an opportunity to sell the product and get a customer to use this new product and get some experience using it. All right? So what I'm suggesting here is actually trying to use both. And I'm going to show you how you might do that. Now, there are all sorts of objectives. We could talk about aspirations, sort of relatively high goals that are concrete and measurable. You can also talk about bottom lines or resistance points. Those are also concrete and measurable. But if you think about aspirations, right, as the type of objective we're going to focus on, realistic but sort of stretch goals, here's a way that you can put it all together, right, a tool. Talked about identifying interests on both sides in earlier steps. Okay, so you've got that on the left-hand side. Talked about resources, right, the capabilities that the parties have. And then aspirations are those objectives that are stretch goals, right, concrete and measurable. So in a chart like this, what you can do is start with interests, look at the resources or capabilities of the other side, the way that you're going to be able to meet your interests, and then set specific targets. All right? So if we go back to our Canadian power company that's looking for steel in Taiwan, all right? One of their interests is low cost of materials, right? They want to keep their expenses down so they can keep their the margins on their profit relatively high. Turns out that RMC has high capacity, right? High production capacity, and as a result, Elgin might look for decreasing RMC's quote by 8%. Concrete and measurable. 8%, not 6, not 9, 8. And you can do the same thing down here. And the value of having this set up this way is once you get into negotiation, if you find that you can't hit your aspirations, let's say RMC says, we won't give you 8, we'll give you 6. Elgin can go back to its original interest. What was that 8% based on? Why did we want 8%? Do we still want to go after 8, or is there another way that we can satisfy our low cost of materials? Maybe we'll stretch out finance terms in terms of payment. Okay? So Another way to talk about this is value creation and value claiming. And interests are sort of a way of, interests and resources are a way of building value or creating value, and objectives or aspirations, as you see there, are a way of sort of claiming value. This is a way to run both of those, because most negotiations are going to entail both, not one or the other, not integrative or distributive, not just value creation or value claiming. Okay? Makes sense? Fifth, envision the interaction. All right? Couple more steps here. What are we talking about here? We've gotten our own act together. We've set priorities, set aspirations or objectives. We have an idea of alternatives that we have, a strategy that we're going to take in the negotiation. But that's all on our side of the table. Now start thinking a bit about how that's going to work with counterpart X or Y. Okay? So here you've got a lot of things that have to do with the relationship or the interaction. Those interactions could take place in a number of arenas. Right? At the table is just one of them. So you're planning for each of these arenas. And if you are going to be negotiating with someone who has a very different approach, as illustrated here, what are you going to do about it? Now here I've borrowed from a four-stage model of cross-cultural negotiation from John Graham, where he says every negotiation involves 4 stages. Okay? Non-task sounding, right? Sort of socializing. Task-related information exchange. Third is persuasion. And fourth is concessions and agreement. What you see here on the top is sort of a North American approach to negotiation. Right, a little bit of time talking about, well, how's the weather, how was your trip into town, and then sort of basically get into, okay, let's talk about the product, right? Information exchange. And a fairly long period of persuasion where you're haggling over terms and trying to move the other side, and they're trying to move you. Concessions toward the end. Well, what about having done your research on the other side, and you're negotiating, say, against the Japanese, and you've heard that they prefer a much longer period of sounding, right? And then after that, a much longer period of information exchange before they even get into persuasion and concession. Right? If you're envisioning the interaction and you know that your preference, the way you usually do things, is at the top, and the way your counterpart usually does things is at the bottom, how are you going to plan? What are you going to do in this upcoming negotiation? Well, we've got a few possibilities. This comes from a piece I did a number of years ago, which simply lays out several options. We hear about negotiating, do as the Romans do, right? A reference here would be if you have a sort of a North American negotiation style and you're negotiating with the Japanese, negotiate the Japanese way. Well, there are some other approaches that you can consider. Right? And given the time, I'm not going to go into each of these, but they range from having them do things your way. Maybe they're adept at that, right? Inducing, or adjustments between the party, and so on. Some considerations to think about. What are you able to do? Right? What negotiation approach can you take? What's feasible? What approach will enable you to connect or develop a coherent interaction with the other side? What's appropriate to the circumstances and to the relationship? Okay? All considerations for which of these strategies you might select. And then finally, since we're using RBC and feel that conditions do affect behavior and relationships, what can we do to shape conditions, especially the circumstances for negotiation, in such a way that it will enable us to negotiate effectively? So you see here sort of setting dates and times, communication channels. Is this going to be face-to-face or via email, via telephone, and so on. And there are all sorts of things that you could consider when it comes to arranging the site. I've actually seen this done, believe it or not. But that's just one negotiator's arrangement. Okay? Here, just quickly, because I do want to open things up before too long, is the kinds of products that each of these steps would produce. Okay? A difference between actually doing the steps and what they result in. And here, I don't know why this got converted, but this is taken from the original. And the key point here is if you've planned well, then really all you need is a pretty simple document that summarizes all of this. Okay, the 6 steps. Now this is, what we've talked about is 6 steps that I think you can do or use for any negotiation. Right? A simple one, as well as a very sophisticated interorganizational one. And these 6 steps could take half an hour, they could take 3 years. But what about the international side of this? And here we get to the 2 questions that I asked at the outset. All right? Why should this system, these 6 steps, why should it work for international business? Or to ask the question in a slightly different way, how does international business affect application of the system? Well, think about some of the things that we've touched on. Okay? International negotiations might raise different types of issues and interests, things that we wouldn't expect to see or that we would normally see in the intranational negotiation. The range of conditions. Right? We don't have different legal systems, different currencies when we're negotiating within a country. We do in an international context. The variation in negotiators' negotiating behavior. Okay? That's probably debatable, but think a bit about the range of negotiation behavior that you can see across the globe as opposed to what you might see in Vancouver or Canada more generally. How does RBC work? Let me just take a quick look at a couple of these. One of the things that occurred to me is that how the objectives that you set, to go back to formulating your representation, remember we talked about that. RP is reservation price, or the highest price you'd be willing to pay if you were a buyer, and IO is initial offer. One thing that can change in an international context is just how big a range that normally is can vary significantly. I mean, the example that comes to mind most vividly for me is an exercise that I do in my negotiation class where students have a price range for for robotics unit that ranges from $65,000 to $75,000. Okay, and I've done this exercise for probably 20 years. When I do it with Americans and Canadians, generally the negotiators will stay somewhere in that price range, right, in the instructions, between $65,000 and $75,000. Several times when I had Americans on the purchasing side and Chinese on the selling side, the Chinese have announced prices starting at $100,000 or $110,000. They're not even within the range that's on the instructions. It throws off their counterparts completely. Right? Some of the things that you might have to deal with when it comes to negotiating with counterparts from other countries or other traditions. The kinds of influence tactics they might use. Here you see the results of a study comparing strategies that Chinese and American managers have used to influence each other. Right? So this is an intra-cultural study. But notice how different the influence strategies are in red from the ones on top. Now there's a proviso here, which is that both the Chinese and the American subjects use rational persuasion the most. Okay. But when it came to who used which of these more, that's where you see the real split. Okay? But again, these are sort of the overt behaviors. I think one of the real challenges is represented right here. This is a great quote from Akio Morita in a book called A Private Life, which was an account of Sony, but also covered a lot about Morita. And this was a man who could go back and forth between the U.S. and Japan pretty fluidly. Okay, he was pretty accomplished. And if he said this, imagine how difficult it would be for the rest of us. Grammar and pronunciation aren't as important as expressing yourself in a way that matches the way Westerners think, which is very different from our thought process. You have to switch off your Japanese way of seeing things, or they will never understand what you are saying. So when you're in America, you must be clear, and when you return to Japan, you must be vague. And the interviewer asks, is it hard to switch back and forth? It's more difficult than you can imagine, even for Morita, who was as accomplished as he was. 2 more slides. Okay? When it comes to these ideas for researchers and for practitioners, and I've just started to sort of work this out, so bear with me. These are some of the things that come to mind, right? First off, there's 6 serious tasks, right? 6 steps. Do they all matter as much as the next step when it comes to their effect on a negotiator's success, or are some more important than others? Or is it hard to say in a general way, because it really does, some steps will be important for some counterparts and other steps will be more important for others? Interests are a part of this framework. They were part of the American frameworks that I criticized, or at least commented on, earlier in the presentation. And yet, can we count on them to really explain what goes on in negotiation? Right? Or is this a particularly sort of American concept? Are there other motivations or explanations that we should pay attention to? Remember the second slide I put up today with Lee Thompson? She said, planning or preparation is the most important part of negotiation, happens before negotiators ever sit down at the table. Is that true? We really don't know. We haven't tested the effect of planning on the negotiation process. And one of those things might be, how important is what an individual negotiator does, planning beforehand for a negotiation? How important is that planning process relative to other forces, bigger forces that might be operating outside the negotiation room? All right? You're trying to entering China in the early 80s. Foreign investors had to enter a joint venture. Right? It wasn't something they chose to do. That was a government requirement. That was one of those forces from the outside that sort of drove that negotiation result. Are there other things out there like that? And if we're talking about relative significance or influence, which is more important? This is a question I hope that we can answer with a yes, but we don't know yet. Okay? I still think that those of you who negotiate on a regular basis can put this system to work for you in a useful way. Think of some of the things that we've talked about in the last few minutes. First off, serious hits, I think, all the dimensions that you need in order to prepare adequately. All right? And bear in mind that these steps, again, don't have to take weeks or months. Some of them can take just a few minutes. Right? But each of the 6 has a use. You've got some tools built in here, like the IRA system, right? Interest, resources, aspirations, like the RBC diagram. Again, think about not only what you're trying to get out of negotiation, but what you can contribute, the resources. and for that matter, what the other side has. And think creatively, right? Not just what you'd expect them to contribute, but if you do your research and find out about some of the other capabilities or resources that they have available, maybe you can tap into that as well. Interests and objectives, right, combined. And then if we go back to the second comment from Barshevsky, right, she said, very few people know what they want to the degree of precision that negotiation requires. Yes, that may be, right? Knowing what you want, I think, is important, but especially when it comes to international negotiation, I think it's important to keep that in mind in a broader context, which is where we get back to the RBC perspective or framework. Okay? With that, I'd love to hear what you think about this six-step system. I haven't mentioned Asian examples very much. Maybe we can start with some of those and applications, but I'll leave it to you to take the discussion wherever you'd like it to go.
Thank you very much. Let's take the discussion. Questions? Comments?
I have two questions. And first one, yes, do you think information management, like data collecting and near the bottom of the counterpart and get more from the negotiation? So how to get the information and how to tell them true or false? I think maybe that's a very important issue in your plan negotiation.
I hear about 6 questions there.
Okay.
But let me start by saying I think gathering information, and as much as possible, especially good information, is very important for planning. Okay? That's different from how much information you reveal to the other side, though. Okay? So information gathering, sort of doing your homework, researching the details, that's one area. But then disclosing information to the other side, that's a different set of considerations. And what you were suggesting is that you pass on the information that you have to the other side, and the more information the two sides have, the better, because then sort of the result is clear and you can reach a good solution. Is that what I heard you say?
Yeah.
I think that depends. I think one has to, and you have to be careful, because this can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you hold information back, they hold information back, and it becomes, it's hard to make much progress because no one really wants to take the first step. But I think the amount of information that you reveal to the other side has to be decided on a case-by-case basis, because I do believe that there are negotiators, counterparts out there who will exploit you as much as they possibly can. And in cases like that, the more information that you provide, the more you're going to be taken advantage of. So I think it's important to think carefully about sort of the kind of counterpart that you face, what they'll do with the information, how it will help or hurt, and then decide how much you're going to reveal. And for that much matter, you don't have to reveal the information all at once either, right? You can reveal it slowly and start with information that might not hurt you if they exploit it, and see if they reciprocate. If they return information that's useful to you, maybe you can build on that. But I think case by case is the way to decide how much information to reveal in general. Did I answer your third, fourth, and fifth question?
My second question, if I have a chance to ask the second one.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, my second is, I agree with you, the culture is very important, especially in the international negotiation. But how the culture impacts the negotiation, such as perspective, the manners, or the habits of different nationalities or organizations. Do you have some examples on that? And also,
Can I take that one? You like to ask multiple questions. First off, I did say culture is important, but I think the other point that I was trying to get across is that I think we've overemphasized culture, so that there are other factors to consider as well, especially in an international, especially in the interorganizational ones involving large companies. Okay. Now, with respect to, you were asking how to get a handle, or how to understand the counterpart's perspective. What was the very end of your question?
I didn't finish my question actually.
Oh, okay.
Actually, the question is how you to narrow the culture gap in a short period, because the negotiation just not a very long period, and how you as soon as you can narrow down the culture shock, the differences.
I think these strategies speak to that. There's an article I wrote. I mentioned it, Negotiating with Romans, in Sloan Management Review, about 1994 or 5, I guess. And the idea here is that there are many ways to narrow or bridge the culture gap. Okay? One possibility, if you don't know much about the other side and they don't know much about you, is to bring in people who are experts in those cultures, right? As agents or advisors, and ask them to help you bridge the gap. And you can see other possibilities as well, sort of depending on how much time you have. I mean, I don't know how long you want me to spend on this topic, but in cases where companies have long-term plans to enter a country and aren't going to enter the country for 2 or 3 years, right? They can do a lot of learning, language learning, culture learning, in that 2 to 3 year period. That's different from my going to Beijing next Monday and trying to prepare in the next 4 days. And in each of those situations, you can do different things. But I think the key is think about all the different strategies you have available, and don't think that the only thing that you can do is learn how they do it and then do it their way. That's the only way to bridge the gap. There are other options out there, and most of the time, I would argue, if you have a short amount of time and you're starting from zero, you're not going to be able to bridge the gap very deeply. A lot of what you're going to be able to do is on the surface. If you're in Japan, you might learn how to offer a business card properly, for example, or you might learn a couple of words like ohayo gozaimasu or domo arigato gozaimasu or something like that. But that's just the surface, right? There's a lot more to bridging the gap. In fact, Jen and I were talking about the mental gap at lunch. Right? And Morita's quote, thinking the way the other people think. We were talking about a book called The Geography of Thought. That's even trickier. Right? Behaving the way other people behave, that's just the surface. But really understanding why they do what they do and getting into their thought, that's the real bridge. But it's much harder to do.
If Hannibal Lecter could only have been a business negotiator, by the way, before this, when you're negotiating with the Romans, does it matter whether you're in Rome or in Toronto?
Some, but not as much as it used to.
First, and then second.
My question may be slightly off your topic, but I'm wondering if there are books you would recommend for Canadians negotiating with America.
Give her your phone number. You spend a lot of time in Pennsylvania.
Well, I am an American by birth, and have spent a fair amount of time there, although not as much as some other places.
You spent 6 years in Japan.
First 10, actually.
10?
Yep. I don't know of that much work. Memoirs of the U.S. ambassadors to Canada. And the last, and for that matter, you could do Canadian ambassadors to the U.S. I don't know if Ritchie, actually, no, he was involved in the trade negotiation. No. Who am I thinking of? If you send me an email, I can send you the titles. But there was the second to last UN ambassador who was, I could picture him, rather thin and sort of plain speaking. And then there was the person before him was a previous governor of Michigan. He's written a book as well, right? So they've both written books. And then there are also books on U.S.-Canada trade negotiations, the NAFTA and also the Free Trade Agreement. So all of those will tell you at least about the governmental side. I don't know much about Canada-U.S. business negotiations. I know of one or two researchers who have done minor studies on that topic, but I hesitate to recommend them to you. Yeah.
Sir,
Dave has something to say.
It's just on the same
One of my
topic.
students, yeah, I just want to follow up. Why wouldn't you recommend someone reading a book written by an American teaching people how to negotiate, and then you contrast that normative behavior? Because what's being suggested by getting the S, for example, in those sorts of books, are normative behavior
that's
of
true.
Americans, right?
Yep.
So a Canadian reading that book would say, wow, is that consistent with the way I might do things?
Yeah, yeah.
Recognizing there's not much written on
Yeah,
Canadian.
no, you're bang on. In fact, it reminds me of a few years ago when I was talking to Japanese businessmen who were taking negotiation workshops run by Americans. And it turned out they weren't taking the workshops in order to learn how to negotiate. They were taking the workshops in order to learn how the Americans thought about negotiation. Yeah.
Who wrote the book? It's a thin book, but it's very, very widely read, called Negotiating with the Chinese.
Pai?
Lucien Pai. If you read Lucien Pai's Negotiating with the Chinese, and you'll realize very quickly, for example, how an American, he's very, very knowledgeable, okay? But his attitude towards what he calls weaving a web of dependency is almost a paranoid attitude towards developing, let's say, non-nitty-gritty business relationships, which of course is the opposite from the Chinese. But I think you can learn a little bit about America. The book is on negotiating with the Chinese, but you learn a lot about the way Americans think, I believe.
Yeah.
Sir?
Superb presentation. And one sentence which I like in your presentation is, negotiation is not just a matter of what you want, but of what you have to offer. My question is, when you look at your process diagram, how important it is to consider the bargaining power of the negotiations? Does it affect your process diagram? Does it affect the process itself? Let's take the perspective of a negotiator which has a very low bargaining power as compared to the other party. How can it pursue its own interests and objectives?
Well, quick answer is do what you can to. I'd go back to the Batten idea. Do what you can to improve your power by increasing your alternatives. And a good example there is a sole source supplier situation, right, where you've had only one source for whatever component or product you've needed for your business. Ultimately, trying to find another source so that you can at least have an alternative, and maybe even developing an in-house capability so that you don't always have to rely on this external source. Toyota is really adept at doing that. They always have an inside sort of supplier available as well as one on the outside, so they don't find themselves on the sort of weaker end. Now that's a longer term proposition, right? If you got to negotiate tomorrow, it reminds me of the question a lot of students ask me when it comes to negotiating for jobs, and what should they do when a corporate rep comes in and says, will you accept income X And my response is try to get them to talk about other things as well. And the other thing is bear in mind that they're talking to you for a reason. They must see something in you of value, right? Don't lose sight of that. Yes, you might be in a relatively weaker power position, but on the other hand, there's something there of value, and use what you can of it.
So if I'm coming from a relatively weaker position in a bargaining process, do I still have to follow all these steps?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. And part of what the bargaining process the planning process will tell you is that you are in that weaker position. But hopefully you'll see a number of facets of the negotiation itself, and not all of them are determined or influenced by power. And now that you've gotten my wheels turning, sorry, it's in the afternoon, I need more coffee. There are many forms of power. Information is power, right? Not just sort of cash in the pocket. In fact, one of the books that's probably about 20 years on negotiation talked about 16 different types of power. So think about, yes, you may be weak in power on one dimension, but what are some other types of power where you have some more resources, and it might actually be stronger than the other side. And then the other thing, too, is that it's not how much actual power you have, but how much power the other side thinks you have. It's all perception.
Hi, you talk about the way to increase bargaining power, like you find another supplier or buyer to increase bargaining power. Do you think that would also somehow decrease the trust by the other partner? If you're trying to seek other...
That's a risk you run. Yep, absolutely. So the question, there are a number of questions that revolve around that issue. Do you let the person that you're negotiating with know that you're negotiating somewhere else at the same time or not? I think it speaks to a lot of the negotiations reported between Americans and Chinese, and the Americans are always complaining about how the Chinese are concurrently negotiating with their competitors, 2 floors down or something like that. There was a great article in Report on Business out of the Globe and Mail in '94, I think, on Nortel's negotiations in Guangdong with the city of Shunde. I'm butchering the language, I know, but and they discovered that while that is Nortel, were negotiating with city officials on 1 floor, 2 floors down, the officials were negotiating with AT&T, all right? And Nortel, complained about how this was not right and unfair and all that sort of thing. And there are lots of reports like that. And I think they felt betrayed. So yes, you do have to be concerned about the effect that can have on your current negotiations. The other thing, too, we may have talked about this at lunch as well, is when you're thinking so much about your alternatives, this BATNA idea, you almost start to lose focus on the current negotiation that you're trying to develop. And instead of sort of focusing on how can you develop this relationship, what does this counterpart need, what do I need from it, and how can I work on it, you're thinking about what I can get elsewhere, right? Because I've got this alternative over here. That's another drawback to focusing too much on alternatives and not on the current relationship. But like many things in negotiation, it's not just it's not a simple sort of straight path. There are always these balances to sort of work with.
I think the Cyrus planning process is very interesting, but it still doesn't address my experience in dealing with Asians in negotiation, which I think it's still back to that gap, that this planning process can help, but it doesn't really get to closing that gap. Dealing with
the gap being the culture gap we were talking about over here?
Culture gap, or the negotiating style, the Chinese or the Japanese wanting to negotiate big. I'm a lawyer by training, and I act on both sides, and you could see that distinction very clearly, trying to get instructions from your Chinese client so that you can negotiate on their behalf, they're absolutely vague. And my experience also is when you get to that level of international negotiation, preparation and planning is usually not an issue, because whether they follow the Starter style or other style, they're actually very prepared, even though they're very vague, but they know what they want. They know where their interest lies. It's just that they may not tell the other side, and they might not even tell you, who's trying to represent them to negotiate. And often they don't do that intentionally. I think it's the lack of appreciation of that fellow who says you got to be able to switch between the Western and the Asian style negotiation. Yeah, I still see that as being the bigger hurdle than not being prepared. I think when you get to that level, everyone's prepared. They're bright business people. They've done this millions of times. They know where they want to get to, but they can't switch. One side can't switch.
Either they can't switch or they haven't thought about how they're going to handle it, in which case I would say they haven't fully prepared. All right? I'd say this diagram helps you in two ways with respect to the gap. First off, researching the details. If you've done a good job of due diligence in research the details, you've uncovered how the other side generally negotiates. And you would know that they tend to be evasive or vague. All right? So you've at least got that bit of information for starters. Then the question is, okay, what do I do about it? Right? How do I bridge the gap? And that's where we talk about envisioning the interaction. So it's not enough to know how they generally negotiate elsewhere, but then when it comes to how they're going to negotiate with you and that interaction, you've got to think about where you'd like it to go and how your style either fits or conflicts with their style. And envision the interaction has to do with how are you going to do that? Okay, what's your plan for putting the wheels in motion in such a way that there will be a coherent interaction that bridges the gap? And I passed over that fairly quickly, but as far as I'm concerned, that would be part of the interaction stage.
Okay, it's 3:30, and I'm going to take advantage of my position here to ask the last question. Do you have a stock answer for a question like this? Supposing the other side, the other team, in a negotiation session is known, for example, for being difficult negotiators, even to the extent of being what we would call rude, using intimidating language and that sort of thing. But they're a customer. You have to get into negotiations every few years when contracts expire and so forth, that you really like their business, but you don't like the way they negotiate. Do you have a formula or an attitude or something, or a series of I want to put it, ready-made responses to situations like that?
Well, I suppose a true Westerner could separate means and ends and just say, ends are the thing that matter anyway, so I'll get over it and just deal with this person. But another possibility is to think about how you might try to change the mix, alter the relationship. And that, again, gets back to envisioning the interaction. And there are books out there that deal with strategies that you can use with difficult negotiators. In fact, Bill Urey, who is the other author of Getting to Yes with Roger Fisher, wrote a book in the early 90s called Getting Past No, subtitled How to Deal with Difficult People or Deal with Difficult Negotiators. And it's a 5-step strategy that you could think about as you're planning how this interaction would take place. The other thing that came to mind that I'm taking away from this discussion is that we've assumed all along that planning is a one-sided process, right? Can you actually prime the pump by engaging the other side in planning with you? Now, that would be sort of real information disclosure, right? If you, even from the beginning, you plan the process together. But I can think of some situations where that might be really helpful. Right? You actually do this, both sides together, as a way of getting on the page and developing, just sort of priming the negotiation process to make it more effective. I mean, it's an
I
option.
think of a lot of instances with regard to particularly East Asia, with my area of least ignorance, where they love to do that simply because it reduces
surprise.
It reduces the likelihood of any embarrassing deadlocks, of any surprises coming up when you get your really top-level leaders involved. So this could be called pre-negotiations. I think that would be that idea would be well received. In fact, probably received with a smile, because they say that's the way we prefer to do things. There's a lot of people I know in Asia. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for coming too. We've enjoyed it very much. I'd like you to leave with a, not too heavy, because we know travelers don't like heavy things, but a treasured David Lamb Center's I'm Fraser University coffee cup.